Hey everyone, welcome back to episode 3 of our TypeScript journey. In the last episode, we explored how variables and data types work, basically how we store and label information in our code. But now it's time to learn how we actually use that information to make our program come alive. Now in this video, we're going to be diving deep into functions, parameters, scopes, and what is import and export. And by the end of this video, you will not only understand what these things mean, but you will also remember them for the rest of your life, because I'm going to explain them in a way that we just simply click. So let's not waste time and get right to it. What is a function? Now, before I explain what a function is, I simply want to remove this code from our previous video. So before I give you guys an explanation of a function in programming terms, I simply want to give you a real life example. So imagine your computer is a restaurant kitchen, and your variables are your ingredients. You have, for an example, flour, sugar, and eggs, and they're all ready to go. But a function is your recipe. It tells the chef what to do with those ingredients to make a final dish. So in programming terms, a function is simply a reusable block of code that performs a specific task. I'm going to say this once again, and I want you guys to pay fully attention and tattoo this into your brain, because literally this is the explanation of a function, and no matter what programming language. So a function is simply a reusable block of code that performs a specific task you give it to. Now, let me give you guys an example. To use a function, what you simply have to do is define the function keyword. And to define a function keyword, what you have to do is you have to simply write down function, and then you have to give your function a name. It can be simply anything that you want. So for an example, I'm going to call my function hi. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use these parentheses. So whenever you see these parentheses close to a name, that means it is a function. And now, what I want to do is I want to define a block for my function. To define a block, what you have to do is you have to use these curly braces. And now whatever code we write inside these curly braces, that code is going to be related to this function called hi. So I'm going to write down something very, very simple. I'll simply use the console.log function or method. And then inside here, I'm simply going to say hello world, which is one of the simplest examples, right? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to call my function. You always have to call your function. And to call your function, you have to call its name. So the name we gave this function was called hi. I'm going to say hi and then parentheses, semicolon. You don't even have to give a semicolon, but it's always a standard to close your code with a semicolon. Now to call my function, I used its name. Now let me show you guys what it's going to return. So ts-node and then index.ts. So as you guys can see, it says hello world. Now when you call it like this, it runs whatever is inside those curly braces. Now think of calling a function like pressing the start button on a machine. You build the machine and now you're telling it to do its thing. We did the same thing here. We built a machine and then we gave it instructions, and then we called the machine, meaning we pressed the start button, and now it gave us the output of what we wanted it to do. That's how functions work. Now, another question is, you guys might be wondering, well, okay, that's all good and stuff, but why do we even need functions? So let me explain it to you guys why we need a function. Now, imagine you're baking cookies for, let's say, 1,000 people, or let's make it 100 people. Would you rewrite the recipe every single time? Of course not. You would reuse the same instructions. And that is exactly what functions do. They let you write code once and reuse it everywhere. Without functions, your code would be repetitive and messy. Meaning if we wanted to run this hello world, let's say 8 times, then we have to use console.log hello world 8 times. Let me give you guys an example. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's a lot of code, right? and we have to and it's not just going to be as simple as console.log hello world. It can be a really complex code. It depends on your project. Now, if we wanted to run this let's say 8 times, then we have to define or type that really complex code 8 times, right? And now if I compile it to you guys, we will have this 8 times. But another way to do this, a really simpler way to do this, is by simply calling our functions 8 or however many times you want. So I'm going to call this let's say 4 times, right? So that's 1, 2, 3, and that's 4. And now if I have to compile this, I'll get 4 values or 4 outputs for my function. So this is how functions work, and why do we need functions. Each time you call this, the code inside runs again, and it means same recipe, same results. Okay? So I hope you guys understood this. Now, another thing is called parameters. What is a parameter? So think of parameters as the ingredients you can customize. Now, what if you don't want every cookie to taste the same? Maybe you want one cookie with chocolate chips and another one with almonds. Now, that is where parameters come in. Like I said, it's ingredients you can customize. So parameters are like the ingredients your function can take to make something slightly different every single time. Now, let me give you guys an example. So let me remove all this and let's make a new function. So to use a function, like I said, you have to use the function keyword and then give your function a name. I'll simply call it greet person. Okay, and then parentheses. Now inside this parentheses, I'm gonna define a parameter called name, and I'll give this a type of string. Okay, and then I'll define a block for my function, and right here I'm gonna say console.log, and what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna simply say I can also use backticks and stuff. I don't have backticks in my current keyboard, so I'm going to use this virtual keyboard right here. And I'm going to use backticks from here. There we go. So right here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say hello, and then I'll use my parameter's name. To use that, I'm going to simply call it by calling the $sign and then curly braces and then my parameter's name, which is called name. And I can also give it an exclamation mark as well. I have to cut this from here and paste it right here. There you go. And now what I have to do is I have to call my function. So to call my function, I'm going to call its name. It's called greet person, and then I'm going to pass a data inside this for the parameter that we made. So I'm going to simply call this, let's say, Steve. And then I'll call it once again, greet person. You don't have to call it once again, but I'm just giving you guys an example. And this time I'll give it another name. I'll call it let's say, Arnstein. That's my friend's name, Arnstein. And there you go. Now, if I have to call my function, well, we already called my function, but if I have to show you the output, then I'm going to run this command. And as you guys can see, it will say, hello, Steve, and hello, Arnstein. So the only reason why I gave you guys this example was to go back to the first explanation of parameters that I gave you guys. I said parameters are the ingredients you can customize. And I give you guys an example. I said, what if you don't want every cookie to taste the same? So if you don't want every cookie to taste the same, you want one with chocolate chips, another one with almonds or peaches or whatever, then this is how you can make changes. Okay, let me go back. Let me go back and show you guys the example that we ran the first time. Right here. So we called it 4 times, right? We called it 4 times, and every single time we ran this, it gave us the same output, meaning the same type of cookie. But now, if we want every cookie to be different, then what we do is we use parameters. And now, if I run my recipe, let's call it recipe. If I run my recipe, it's going to give me different cookies. Okay, I hope you guys understand what parameters are and why do we use them. Okay, now let me explain to you this in more details. So the name inside the parentheses, this is our parameter, okay? And when we call the function and give it a value like Steve here and then Arnstein, that value is called an argument. Okay, so this is a parameter and this value that we gave is called an argument. So think of parameters as placeholders and think of arguments as the actual thing you pass in. Okay, once again, I'll explain this. So this is my parameter, and then the value we passed inside our function is called an argument, okay? Our parameters are placeholders, and then our arguments are the actual thing we pass in, meaning the value that we pass in, okay? So I hope you understand what an argument is, what a parentheses is, and what a function is. Now, another thing we have is called the return keyword, and it's used to send something back to us. Now, let me give you guys another example on that as well. But before I do, let me give you guys a real life example. So far, our functions are just, are just doing stuff, but sometimes we want them to give us something back, like a math formula that returns like a result or whatever. And now, in order to do that, what we have to do is we have to use the return keyword. And to use the return keyword, we have to simply make a function, and I'll just simply call it add, and I'll give it a number. Let's say A is gonna be type of number, and then B is also gonna be a type of number. And then what we want is we want our results to be returned in a number. Okay, and then I'll define a block for my function, and right here I'm going to use the return keyword, and I'll say return me A plus B, or A like the sum of A and B. And then what I'm going to do here is, let's say I'm going to make a const, and I'll say results, and I'll put the value of result in this variable we called result, or you can call this whatever you want. For an example, I'll just call this apple. Now I'm gonna save the result that we get from this function into this variable called apple. Okay, to do that, what I'm gonna say is I'm gonna call my function, which is called add, and then I'll pass the arguments, which, if you remember, like a second ago I explained what an argument is. So I'll say 5 and 7. Okay, and then I'll simply console.log this to show you guys the output. So console.log, and then what we're going to console.log is going to be apple, not the function apple. Why apple? Because we literally defined the whole function with the return key and its values inside this variable called apple. We saved it. Basically, we saved it there. So I'm going to call apple here. Don't worry, I'll give you guys another example. It's just, if you're confused, I'll give you guys another example. Now, if we run this inside our terminal, this is the result we get, 12. Okay. Now we can also do another thing. We can also call this we don't even need to store this in a variable. We can simply call this add, and then we can say 5 and 7. And if I run this, it will be 12. Now if I make this, let's say 12 and 12, it should give us 24. And there it goes. You guys can see. So what I'm trying to say is you don't need a variable to store the end results. But if you do, that's actually a good standard. That's a good thing if you do. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to say. Now, when this function runs, it takes 5 and 7 and adds them, and then returns the total. The cool part is that you can now store that result in a variable and use it anywhere else. It's like asking a machine for juice and it doesn't print the juice, it gives it back to you. That's why we use variables. But I already showed you you don't like need a variable, but if you do, then that's really cool because you can use it pretty much anywhere that you want to. Okay, so there's that. Now another concept is called scopes. What is a scope? Now here's something that confuses a lot of beginners. Scope basically means where your variables or functions can be seen or used. Now, let me give you guys an example, a real-life example. Before I get into the technical examples or show you the code, I always love to give real-life examples. So, imagine your house. You have keys to your bedroom, but your neighbors don't. That's called a private scope. But then when it comes to your living room, everyone in the house can use it and can see it and can also enter. That's called a global scope. So we have two types of scopes. We have a, let me write this down here. Give me a second. So we have a private scope and then we have a global scope. Okay, and the difference between private and global scope is, I'll give you guys the example. I'll say this once again. So a private scope is like, let's say you have a house, and in your house you have a room called the bedroom where it's basically your room, and only you have the keys to that room, which means it's private and only you can enter that room and others can because they don't have the key for it. But a global scope, I gave you guys another example, was it's like your living room, meaning all your family members can go there, can use the living room, can sit there, talk, watch movies or whatever, meaning everyone can go there and it's global. Okay, now let me give you guys the example for this. So let's make a variable. I'm pretty sure you guys do know what a variable is by now. So I'll call this global. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to store something here, and I'm going to simply say something like, I don't know, like I am global scope. Okay. And now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make a function. So function, and I'll call my function something like living. Okay. And then parentheses, and then my block. So inside here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to define a local scope. Okay, now, or a private one. Yeah, a private scope, not like a local scope. I don't want you guys to get confused. So let's make a private scope, and I'll call this a private. Okay, and then I'll assign a value to this, and I'm gonna say, hola, I am a private scope. Okay, I also need to say hola here. Hola, I am a global scope. Oh, I was wrong here. Declare, okay, yeah, whatever. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to console.log to show you guys like the example. I'm going to console.log the global scope, okay, which we call global. And then I'll also console.log the local one, which we made, and it's called private. Not local, but like private. I don't want you guys to get confused. So private right here. Let me close these. And now let me call my function. So my function is called living. And yeah, pretty much it. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to also call my functions, not functions, but like my variables here. So, and then global, and also console.log, and I'll call this private. So the private one, what's going on here? Okay, well, let's call this private with like double E. Right? Yeah. So now variables declared. Let me comment this out. Okay. And let me run this just to show you guys what we're going to get as an output. So hola, I am a global scope. And then hola, I am a private scope, and then we define my global scope once again, which is this. And now if I comment this out, we'll get an error. And if I run this, private, whatever. So basically, yeah, private, yeah, that's yep, that's the same name. So anyways, let me explain to you what we did here. Basically, variables declared inside a function are private variables, meaning only that function can see them. And variables declared outside of this function are global. Everyone can access them. Now, understanding this will save you from hundreds of random bugs later on. And let me give you guys another example. Maybe this was kind of like confusing or whatever. So let's make a variable here and let's call it something like, I don't know, living room. Yeah, there you go, living room. And I'll give this a value. I'll simply say living room, or yeah, living room, there you go. Or in, I think, like TV room would be better. So TV room, and then let's make a function, and I'll call this function something like example, okay? And I'll define my block as block here, and inside here I'm gonna make another private variable, or like private scope, or whatever you want to call it, and I'll simply name this bedroom, and I'll also assign a value to this, and I'll say bedroom with like capital letters, bedroom, there you go. And now if I console.log my living room here, which is my global scope, so I'll simply say living room, yes. And then I'll also console.log my bedroom, so bedroom right here. Okay, cool. Now what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna call my function, which is called example. Let's run this. Whoops. So I got TV room and I got bedroom. Now if I console.log, what was it called? Yeah, bedroom, it will throw us an error. If we go here, it will say cannot find name bedroom. Why? Because it's a private scope, meaning it can only be accessed inside that function. And if we try to access it outside of that function, it will give us an error. But now if I call my global scope, so console.log, it's called living room, it will not throw us any errors. And the reason for that is because it's a global scope, meaning you can access it from anywhere that you want, even inside a function, okay? But private scopes, private variables, or like private scopes cannot be accessed outside of a function. And this is the example that I give you. Even if I type, like, let's say, even if I type here bedroom, it will not show it to me in the recommendations tab, or whatever you want to call this. It won't show this to me. But if I do this with like living room, as you guys can see, it's the first option we got. So yeah, this is the difference between like between scopes. So private scope and global scope, that's the difference. Private scopes can only be accessed inside a function, and global scopes can be accessed from like anywhere that you want. So like I gave you the example of your bedroom and then your living room. So yeah, I hope you guys understand what that is. Now, another thing we want to talk about is called the import and export. So let's just start with a simple idea, okay? Let me write this down here. Okay, exporting. So exporting means making something available for other files. So exporting means making something available for other files, and importing means bringing it in so we can use it. Now, there are two types of exports in TypeScript. Let me write this down here, exports. So there's two types. The first one is called named export, and the second one is called default export. Okay? Now let's go through both of them carefully. Let's talk about the first one, named exports. What is that? So named export is the most common type. You name what you're exporting, and when you're importing, you don't need to use the exact same name inside a parentheses. Okay? I know you're confused, but hear me out. I'll give you guys a lot of examples, okay? A lot of examples. Now, let me make a file here. I'll also explain this once again before I make a file. So, named exports. Like I said, this is the most common type. So basically what you have to do is you have to name what you're exporting, and when importing that, you must use the exact same name inside a curly braces, okay? Let me give you guys an example to this. I'll make a file called math utils, I guess, .typescript. And inside here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to export something because this is what we are learning right now, exporting. So I'll say export my function, and my function is called add. Basically the same example that I showed you guys like a minute ago. A is going to be a number, and then B is also going to be a number, and then I also want my results in number. And now inside this block, I'm going to, or you know what, no, I don't want this as numbers. So inside this block, what I'm going to do is I'm going to return A plus B, okay? And now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make another one called export, and I'll call this something like subtract, and I'll give it A as number. These are values, so A is number, and then B also as number. And then my block here, and I'll simply return this. So return A minus B. There we go. The issue here, a top level export modify cannot be used on. Okay, so inside my TypeScript config file, I need to find that, which is called, what was it called? Yeah, this one. It needs to be false. And yeah, there you go. So what we did here was we defined two export functions. Like basically we want to export these. And now what I'm going to do here is inside, let's say my index.js file, what I'm going to do is I'm going to import these. So to import this, since it's not default, we're going to be using the curly braces, and the first function was called add, so I'll import add, and then another one was called subtract. Let me copy this and paste it right here. And then we're going to define where are we going to be importing these from. So I'll say from, and then math.utils. Yeah, that's the file, math.utils. And then I'm simply going to say console.log, and I'll simply use this function, and I'll give it a number, let's say 10 and 20 for like addition, and then console.log. The other one was called subtract, and I'm going to say it's going to be like 120 and 5. Yeah, I guess that's a fair value. Now, if we run this, hold on, let me see what the error is. It is not under root directory. Root directory is expected to contain all source files. Okay, let's go back here. Root directory. It's right here, root directory. And what we need to do is we need to define this inside this root directory file here. believe it's gonna, yeah, there we go. And now if I run my file, there we go. So we got 30 and then we got 150. Let me change this to, I don't know, like 30 and then this to like 70. Let's run this once again. And yeah, we got 40 and 65. So yeah, it works. And you see the curly braces here? That's because we are picking specific exports from this file called modutils. So it's like choosing what tools you want from a toolbox, okay? That's why if we want to choose specific functions, or not functions, but something specific we want to import, then we use curly braces with it. But if we don't want to choose something specific, and if we want to choose like an only option, then what we can do is we can use the default export. But before I talk about that, I simply want to say, so another reason why we use these curly braces with named export is because a file can export many named items, a function, variable, classes, and the curly braces lets you select which ones you want. So think of curly braces like a shopping list. You open the file and you say, okay, I'll take this and that and that. And right here, what we did was we opened curly braces and I said, from this file, I want to choose this and that, okay? If we, let's say for an example, if we had another one, okay, if we had another export, let me go here and paste this. If we had another export called something like James or whatever, and if we don't like define it here, then that's completely okay. But if we do, then it will simply mean from this file, from mat.utils, I want to choose add, I want to choose subtract, and I also want to choose James. But if I don't want to choose James, that's completely fine, okay? So like I said, it's like a shopping list. You simply define or you simply choose what you want. That's called a named export, meaning we named or export, and it's called subtract and add, okay? I hope you understand what a named export is. Now, coming to default export, let me define it here, default export. So, what is a default export? Now, a file can only have one default export, okay? It's like saying this is the main thing from this file, or the main thing that this file gives you, okay? Let me give you another example. Let's create another file. I'll call it hi.ts. And right here, let me make export default, and then I'll call my function here, and I'll call it greet, and then I'm gonna pass a parameter, the same thing we did like a minute ago. I want its type to be string, and then what I'm gonna do here is I want to call this so console.log, and since my keyboard doesn't have these backticks, I'm gonna use my virtual keyboard and use backticks. Yep. Okay, and then I'll give it a value, hello, and I'm gonna call this what the name it has, the name of my parameter, it's called name. So there is that. And I'll also create another file. Okay, I don't actually need to create another file. Let me import it inside mat.utils. Okay, let me import it here. I can also import it in my index file, but let me import it here as well. Or you know what, let me import it here because I already have this example here. So to import this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply say import, and I'm not going to use curly braces. I'm simply going to say import greet, which is the name of my function right here. I'm going to say import greet from where? From this file called hi. Let me find this. Okay, there we go. It's called hi. And then I'm gonna call this function, so greet, and I'll pass it a name, Arnstein. There you go. Is it called greet? Yes, it's called greet. Export default. Let me see if I have made any mistakes. So export default, default. There you go. And now if I run this file, we got hello Arnstein and this and that. Now, the reason why I didn't use these curly braces is because, like I said, the export default can only return one thing, and it's going to be the main thing. We can't use export default again in our file. If I do, it's going to throw me errors. So as you guys can see, cannot redeclare exported variable default duplication. Well, the duplication is for this, but if I let's change this to king or whatever, it's still gonna throw errors, okay? Because we can only have one default in our file, one export default in our file. And then to import it, this is how we import. Named exports is gonna be imported with a curly braces, because like I said, named export is like a shopping list. You choose what you want. So we chose add and subtract from this file mat.utils. And then with default export, what we did was, since it's the main thing and we can't really have anything else, so we are not going to use these curly braces. So the whole purpose of these curly braces is to choose like more than one thing, okay? And since with default we only have one thing, one main thing, and we can't really have anything else, so we use it without curly braces. This is like the most simplest way to understand this, okay? And now another question is, you might be wondering, okay, importing installed packages, how does that work? Because let me see. Okay, I don't really have any, but I do have any packages here. I only have ts.node, which like doesn't really need an import. Yeah, but anyways, to import installed packages, meaning when you install a package on your project, how are you gonna import that? Okay, so the way you're gonna import that is same as you import default functions or default exports, because they all have default export. So for an example, if I install, let's say, React or Express or whatever, the way I'm gonna import that into my file is gonna be the same way I'm gonna be importing default exports, okay? Or default functions, or whatever you want to call it, because it has only one thing. So if I'm installing React, it's only React, like it doesn't have anything else. So this is how I'm going to import it, because it has only one thing. So basically it's default. And then if I want to like import a package that has like two main files or whatever, then or not two main files, but like has more than one file and we can choose from them, then we use curly braces. Like I said, it's going to be like a shopping list. I'm going to choose this and that and that. But with one file, with one package that has one main default, this is how we are going to be importing those. In the next video, I'll show you that. But for now, I actually don't really have an internet connection, as you guys can see, so I can't really show you that. But yeah, this is how it goes. So in this video, what we learned was, we learned what a function is, why do we even need functions, we learned about parameters, we learned about scopes and the type of scope we have, private and global. I gave you guys an example about that. And then we talked about what is import and export and what does each one of them means and how we actually use them. So in the next video, I'm going to be explaining you guys something completely different. I don't really know what I'm going to be making that video about, because I haven't really structured it, but it's going to be something really cool. So stay tuned for that, and don't forget to like and subscribe. And yeah, with that being said, have a nice day, guys, and I'll see you guys in the next video.